American boots are on the ground in Nigeria, right? And that is the same African nation where Trump has amplified allegations of Christian genocide, which led him to authorize strikes against extremists in the country on Christmas Day. And now as the United States is getting even more involved, we gotta talk about what Trump's getting wrong about the situation in Nigeria and how the country's latest massacre is just one example of that. But really where we need to start is how he got here in the first place. And so one of the biggest things you need to know is that certain Christian activists, they've spent years pushing for American intervention in Nigeria. Though I will say, more recently, American lawmakers and even celebrities, they've taken up the cause. Right, going back to Trump's first term, you had him designating Nigeria as what's known as a country of particular concern. And that's a label meant for countries where religious freedoms threaten, basically putting them on a short list for sanctions. But then you had the Biden administration lifting Nigeria's designation in 2021. There you had the State Department's Religious Freedom Report noting that mass killings in the country were indiscriminate, affecting both Christians and Muslims. And that determination, it stayed pretty much the same for the remainder of Biden's presidency. But then you had Trump returning to the White House, and this seemingly provided those activists with another opening. And in fact, you had the New York Times reporting that 24 activists from groups dedicated to exposing Christian persecution around the world, they pursued various Trump officials as well as Republicans in Congress. And so in March, for example, you had a Nigerian bishop speaking to the House Subcommittee on Africa, with him telling its members that the experience of the Nigerian Christians today can be summed up as that of a church under Islamist extermination. Right, and what happened in the country in July, it seemed like proof. It was one of the most horrific massacres that the country has seen in years. Attackers shot to death, hacked to pieces, and burnt alive at least 100 civilians in a village in Nigeria's north-central region. It was a mostly Christian village, and the perpetrators, they were believed to have been bandits belonging to one of the country's predominantly Muslim ethnic groups. So these religious organizations on Capitol Hill, they shared stories about the attack in an effort to get the lawmakers' attention. One that really struck a chord with them, reportedly, was published by the Free Press, which is that outlet that was founded by media executive Barry Weiss, who has more recently come under repeated fire for changes that she's making as the new editor-in-chief of CBS News. But in any case, right, that article, it emphasized that Christians had been killed by Muslims, and then it slammed mainstream media for not paying more attention. It also pointed to figures given by religious groups to argue that violence specifically targeting Nigerian Christians for their faith is widespread, and the issue, it quickly picked up steam on Capitol Hill, where you first had Virginia Representative Riley Moore citing the attack when he introduced a House resolution condemning the persecution of Christians in Muslim-majority countries. You then had Texas Senator Ted Cruz introducing a measure calling for sanctions against Nigeria, and finally, you had these groups actually securing a meeting with Trump officials near the White House in late October. And it was then, only just a couple of days later, that Trump took to Truth Social to announce that he had officially redesignated Nigeria as a country of particular concern. And he then followed that up by writing, "If the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, the USA will immediately stop all aid and assistance to Nigeria and may very well go into the now disgraced country, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities." And then adding, "I am hereby instructing our Department of War to prepare for possible action. If we attack, it will be fast, vicious, and sweet, just like the terrorist thugs attack our cherished Christians. Warning, the Nigerian government better move fast." And from there, you even had Nicki Minaj posting about the issue on social media, with her actually being invited to speak about the alleged Christian persecution in Nigeria at the United Nations. You also had that same bishop testifying to Congress again, telling the committee, "Church alone cannot stop the killings. It requires coordinated political, military, and humanitarian intervention." You even had dozens of current and retired NFL players signing an open letter calling on Trump to do more to confront religious persecution in Nigeria. Right, and in the background, the U.S. military began assessing strike options and conducting intelligence gathering surveillance flights over large parts of the country. Right, and then on Christmas Day, which was reportedly a deliberate choice by Trump, it launched an attack involving more than a dozen Tomahawk cruise missiles on what it said were Islamic State targets. With Trump then writing on Truth Social, "The United States launched a powerful and deadly strike against ISIS terrorist scum in northwest Nigeria, who have been targeting and viciously killing primarily innocent Christians at levels not seen for many years and even centuries." And adding, "I have previously warned these terrorists that if they did not stop the slaughtering of Christians, there would be hell to pay, and tonight there was. May God bless our military, and Merry Christmas to all, including the dead terrorists, of which there will be many more if their slaughter of Christians continues." Now with that, you notably had a spokesperson for Nigeria's Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirming that the strikes had been carried out in cooperation with his government, but you also had him adding, "Terrorist violence in any form, whether directed at Christians, Muslims, or other communities, remains an affront to Nigeria's values and to international peace and security." Right, and that is the Nigerian government has consistently denied any systematic persecution of Christians, but they've also kind of stopped arguing with the Trump administration while they're under pressure, with the country's national security advisor saying after the strikes, "We are not going to get bogged down on narratives." So we've actually seen tension subsiding and increased cooperation. And so last month, high-ranking American officials went to Nigeria to announce increased military cooperation between the two nations. And just this week, we had the U.S. military deploying a small military team to Nigeria, the first acknowledgement of boots on the ground, or with an unnamed former U.S. official telling Reuters that the U.S. team appeared to be heavily involved in intelligence gathering to help go after terrorist groups. But also, a big thing is if they're only trying to protect Christians, they're going to be leaving a lot of people left to die, because there is no real solid evidence that Christians are being killed more frequently than any other religious group. All that's really clear is that a lot of people are being killed. Nigeria isn't technically at war, but more people are killed there than in many war-torn countries. In 2025 alone, it's been reported that more than 12,000 people were killed by various violent groups. And the victims, they include large numbers of both Christians and Muslims, and there are many many different reasons for that violence. There's been what's been described as a jihadist insurgency, mostly in the Northeast and Northwest, which is where most of the people and most of the victims of armed groups are Muslim. But with that, you have at least two main groups operating there that are affiliated with the Islamic State. In the Northwest, you have the Islamic State West Africa Province, which is an offshoot of Boko Haram. And in the Northeast, you have the lesser-known Islamic State Sahel Province. And then on top of all that, also in the Northwest, as well as the North Central regions, you have armed groups often described as bandits, looting, and kidnapping for ransom. And in the North Central region, you also have a lot more violence between predominantly Christian farming communities and mostly Muslim groups of nomadic herders. And you have experts saying that these clashes, they're rooted in competition over land and water, but they are exacerbated by religious and ethnic differences. And similarly, kidnappings targeting priests, for instance, it may seem like an obvious example of religious targeting, but you have many analysts reportedly seeing this as really being more driven by money than religious hatred. And that's apparently because priests are viewed as influential figures whose worshippers or organizations can quickly mobilize funds. And then ultimately with all this, right, data collected by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Program, it shows that there were nearly 12,000 attacks against civilians in Nigeria from 2020 until September of last year. And you had 385 of those attacks resulting in 317 deaths being described as targeted events against Christians where Christian identity of the victim was a reported factor. And you also had 196 attacks resulting in 417 deaths, similarly being described as targeting Muslims. And then of course I have to mention, this data, it's far from perfect. Stats relied on for advancing claims of Christian persecution, they're sometimes incredibly dubious. Right, Ted Cruz and Riley Moore, for example, they have cited the work of a Nigerian man who claims to have documented 125,000 Christian deaths in Nigeria since 2009. But his reporting, it's often not double-checked, and it's almost entirely based on secondary sources such as Christian interest groups and Google searches. He also reportedly called for what would likely be considered the ethnic cleansing of a Muslim-majority group in the country. And then even his own flawed methodology, it said that there were at least 60,000 deaths in that same time period among those he described as moderate Muslims. The most recent violence, it's only gone to show how it affects everyone. Right, this last Tuesday, gunmen believed to be with one of the Islamic State affiliated groups. They killed more than 160 people in 2 villages in north central Nigeria. You had local politicians saying the attackers had rounded up residents, bounded their hands behind their backs, and killed them, as well as burned down homes and shops. Residents also telling Reuters that the gunmen were jihadists who often preached in the village, and they demanded that the locals ditch their allegiance to the Nigerian state and switch to Sharia law. And when the villagers pushed back, they said that the militants opened fire. Right, at least one X account with more than 200,000 followers connected the attack to recent kidnappings at a Catholic school and churches, saying they executed 170 Christians for refusing Sharia law. But we've also seen reports that this was a mostly Muslim community, with Nigeria's president saying in a statement, "It is commendable that community members, even though Muslims, refuse to be conscripted into a belief that promotes violence over peace." But yeah, ultimately, that is where we are right now. It is a horrifying, horrible situation. Something does need to be done. But also with that, I think it's important that people realize that it is very complicated, and there are a number of people pushing narratives that are not exactly accurate, or they're outright lies, depending on who's talking.